The Baltimore Ravens now have a little bit more wiggle room after the NFL announced a massive increase in the 2024 salary cap compared to projections. But how do the Ravens' plans actually change with the new cap increase? We'll talk about that and so much more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. Welcome in to another edition of Locked On Ravens. We're a daily Baltimore Ravens podcast here, and I'm your host, Kevin Ostraker of Ravens Wire, coming at you from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, thank you so much for being here today on Locked On Ravens, and as always, making us your first listen each and every day. We are free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube. You can hit like that subscribe button. Also in audio form on YouTube, where you can follow along there as well. Subscribe there. Also, we're 5 days a week of Ravens content. So news, analysis, updates, we have it all here for you. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel. Make it from more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We got some big news about the Ravens and the whole NFL, honestly, with the major salary cap increase. We're going to get more into it today with Brian McFarland, who we had on a couple weeks ago. I'm grateful that Brian's back. Obviously, he's Ravens salary cap of Russell Street Report. And Brian, I think just a little bit's changed since we last talked a couple weeks ago. We were kind of working with projections and different numbers, but now we officially know the NFL salary cap is, I think, a lot more than you or I or anybody was anticipating.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, early reports were somewhere between 240 and 250 million. Obviously, that's a large range. Then after that, I guess, then there was talk it was going to be on the lower end of that spectrum. And then just last week, so we had kind of been working for months on the lower end of the spectrum, so to speak. I kept it at 245 with fingers crossed that it would at least get to there on that low end of the spectrum, the top of the low end of the spectrum, I guess we'll say. And then just last week, Pro Football Talk reported that it could possibly go up to 250. And obviously it blew that away by 5.4 million more. So we've got a cap of 255.4 million, which obviously helps everybody because, I mean, every team gets the same cap. But for the Ravens being tight against the cap and facing a Madubuike potential for the franchise tag, it's a lot of help. I mean, that extra from 10 from where I was projecting makes a big difference.
Yeah, and a 30 million increase from where it was last year, which I think just makes a huge difference for everybody. And obviously, this will mean that the value of contracts in general will go up with the increase in salary cap. We're going to see bigger money contracts. Now, obviously, we'll talk about franchise tag numbers, fifth-year numbers, because those are also official. But with the Ravens having 10 million more than you initially projected, Brian, how much does it actually change what they can do? And does it give you a new look on the offseason, or does it remain mainly the same for you?
I mean, for the most part, it remains the same, I think. Now, the teams obviously have had obviously better idea than we did on where the cap was going to be. So that their planning hasn't changed much internally, probably. What it does do, I think, potentially is it might save a guy who they might have thought about releasing, Pat Ricard, Morgan Moses, guys that would have saved them $4 and $5 million. I think that probably is the biggest effect as they were going to be looking for places to find, cap space. And unfortunately, sometimes you got to make tough decisions and let go of a guy that you didn't want to because you just need that cap space, especially if you're going to have to put down a $22 million tag on Madubuike. So I think that's one of the main things. And I think it helps them definitely re-sign some of the lesser middle free agents, not your minimum guys, because they aren't going to make much of a difference on the cap. But a guy like Darby or Mellette, corners that they probably would like to have back, that gives them an extra million or so that they can throw at those guys in an effort to get them back that they might not have been able to do. They might have had, to rely on draft picks, undrafted free agents. They're two young corners who've been banged up for most of their 2 years. But so that's, I think those two things especially just make it easier for them to navigate things.
And we had talked a lot a couple weeks ago about the restructures, and obviously some of that is still going to have to happen. But with, 5, 10, however many people were projecting over for you, it was 10 million, Brian. With that, maybe a restructure or two doesn't have to happen, or they don't have to try to push money further down the line so it impacts 2025 or 2026. Is there an avenue where maybe now we'll see maybe one less restructure or two less restructures because the Ravens have a little extra money to work with?
Yeah, perhaps. That's because you don't want to restructure too many contracts and keep pushing money down the road. A guy like Marlon Humphrey, could be a restructure. I don't think he's taking a pay cut or anything like that, but that was, he would have been one of the guys they could have gotten a decent chunk of change out of, but they've already restructured him a couple of times. Mark Andrews too, they've already restructured a couple of times. So I think you're right. I think that allows them to, okay, well, we don't need that $5 million that we thought we were going to, so we can leave that alone because that might bite us in the rear end down the road.
And I think it's also important to recognize for Baltimore that even though, this gives them, I think, right around 12-ish to 15 million cap space right now, they're going to have a lot more. We talked about Tyus Bowser a couple weeks ago, Brian. We talked about some of these guys that likely won't be on the roster. But one of the guys that people have been going back and forth on is a Ronnie Stanley, and whether that will be a post-June 1 cut or whether there will be some sort of a restructure there. I'm not sure he will come back on his full, money this year. It's a very large cap hit, the second highest on the team, and obviously the first being Lamar Jackson. But does maybe this new cap change anything for you in terms of Ronnie Stanley and what they can do with his contract?
Yeah, it might. I think he's probably a guy they would go to look to for a pay cut. $15 million. He's due $15 million in cash between a base salary of $11 million and a $4 million roster bonus. So that's something where, they might have gone to him and said, we need to reduce this $8 million. Now, maybe they don't have to go that far. Maybe they can do a little higher number to keep him happier and maybe bridge a gap there so they can keep him around. I still think they're a better team having him around than not having him around, because obviously that's, replacing your starting left tackle. Unfortunately, there's no heir apparent on the roster at this point, really. So, whether that's you can't always expect a late first round pick to be plug and play sometimes, especially at left tackle. So that probably helps in that case as well. So I think it helps with guys they have already, and guys they'd like to, that they've had this past year that there are pending free agents. If it changes things for outside free agents, I guess we'll see. I still don't think they're going to have a whole lot of wiggle room unless they do a lot of restructures. But obviously there's still a lot of talk out there about a running back and that they're doing their homework on the running backs and for some pretty decent sources. So maybe there is something to that. They're certainly not going to go crazy on the free agent market, but this certainly helps out as well.
Yeah, and with their own guys, even going back to Madubuike, do you think that this could even help maybe push along an extension where you can give Madubuike maybe a little bit more year one money and not have to push all the way down the line because there is a little extra to work with? So if you backload that contract on the old cap, maybe it was you can only give them a certain amount of year one money because they'd be up against it. But maybe with this, you could give them a little more of that year one cash and then not have as much to worry about on the back end of that deal. Is that something that could work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, usually on a first year deal, that first year salary is a little over $1 million, basically the minimum, and then the signing bonus proration on top of that. It could be that they move some out of the signing bonus and move it to base salary, which will decrease potential dead money down the road, and increase his cap number this year a little bit. But now that they feel they have a little more wiggle room, then that's certainly a possibility.
And the other two, I mean, we talked about the big three, Patrick Queen, Geno Stone. Personally, I don't think this necessarily changes too much in terms of those two guys coming back. It's nice, but again, you kind of talk about where those guys are probably going to get backloaded deals. And if they were to come back to Baltimore, they'd be getting a backloaded deal anyway. And you mentioned how that base salary is usually right around that $1 million number. I don't think those two. I've seen some people on the social media airwaves say, "Oh, maybe now this could open up. Yeah. You can bring back Matty BK and Patrick Queen." I don't see it happening for Queen or Stokes.
No, I don't either. I think that one's been set in stone pretty much since they, didn't pick up the 5th-year option last year and drafted Trenton Simpson. I think that was a move where there is an heir apparent, as opposed to Stanley, there is an heir apparent there. Is he going to be as good as Queen? Well, that's all to be determined, but that's what you have to do. You have to make some tough decisions like that. There's no question they would love to have Queen back. It just, somebody's out there is probably going to just give him a contract, especially now with the higher cap, that you're going to be kind of scratching your head at, wow, got that much, and I can see that happening for sure.
Yeah. And the interesting part of it is not for those two, but for Jadeveon Clowney and Kyle Van Noy, where I think some people think, well, yeah, maybe you bring back one and you lose one just based off both those guys earn pretty good paydays based off how they played last year. I'm not saying that, it's a guarantee it can bring both back now, but do you think there's at least an increased possibility if both guys want to return that with the extra cap, they could fit both of them in?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. That's where, like I said, those middle range free agents that it might make it easier to get those guys back, because you can throw you have an extra $1 million or $2 million to throw at them now, perhaps, that you didn't anticipate having. And obviously it's all a fluid situation. You sign one guy, what happens? Where's the next guy? What's he getting offered elsewhere? You lose one, then maybe the second one becomes more important, and now you're not trying to get two, but you can throw an extra $1 million or $2 million at the guy that's still left, because you need to have at least one of them back.
Right. We know this is a talented free agent class, and they're going to have decisions to make, but this makes it a little easier to make a few of these. It doesn't, change every single thing that goes on this offseason, but it's nice to have a little extra money for this for sure. Coming up, though, we'll be talking a little bit more about if Baltimore can now spend specifically on some outside free agents. So be sure to stay tuned. Plenty to get to on Locked On Ravens. First, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And how's your social battery right now? Is it drained? Are you bursting with energy? There are a lot of different levels to it. And sometimes, for me, I'm a warm weather person, so I feel like my social battery in the winter, it does feel a little drained. I just feel like a happier person during warm weather personally, but it can be easy to ignore our social battery and spread ourselves thin, especially with social gatherings picking up after the winter. What's the right amount of socializing for you? And how do you recharge? Maybe you thrive around people, or maybe you need some more alone time. Therapy can give you the self-awareness to build a social life that doesn't drain your battery. And there's so many different benefits to therapy. For example, learning positive coping skills. You can learn how to set boundaries. You can empower you to become the best version of yourself. And it isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma. It's for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's not convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a review questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We are back here on Locked On Ravens with Brian McFarland of Russell Street Report. I am Kevin Oestreicher. And Brian, I think the excitement of free agency for a lot of people comes from bringing in new talent, bringing in new faces, and seeing new guys coming into your team. And for Baltimore, they've certainly done that over the years, and they haven't gone necessarily super crazy in free agency, but they've made some splash moves. I mean, the Marcus Williams signing a couple of years ago comes to mind, and there have been plenty that has happened. But now with this extra wiggle room to work with, a lot of people are saying, well, you talked about, you particular with the running backs you talked about in the first segment, Brian. Oh, now you can go get Derrick Henry and you can bring in all these guys. But can they actually now afford to spend? I think Spotrac has Derrick Henry. I think when we checked last time, it was 2 years, $20 million with 13 guaranteed. Saquon Barkley is going to probably cost a little more because of his age, and same thing with Josh Jacobs. But do you think it's a smart decision now for Baltimore to look into this thing? Because we know that 3 of their 4 running backs are a free agent. The 5th running back, and Keith Mitchell, he's going to be out potentially for a chunk of the season here.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly seems to be a lot of smoke. Whether that actually means there's fire or not, I guess we'll find out. It surprises me a little. I mean, I understand the idea of having that, which, I mean, that's what everybody hoped J.K. Dobbins would turn into, that, the lead back, that star lead back. but it seems, I don't know, they've been able to find running backs pretty well. I mean, Gus Edwards was a undrafted free agent. Hill was a lower draft pick. Mitchell was an undrafted free agent. So it would surprise me a little, but there definitely seems to be, like I said, there seems to be a lot of smoke about it. So we'll see if that actually happens. I think one of the things that's going to be very telling for how the Ravens are going to approach this offseason, and we don't have the numbers yet, but I'm looking at the numbers for Nelson Aguilar's deal. 1 year, $3.75 million. That doesn't tell us a lot. We don't know if there's incentives on top, or that 3.75 includes, that's the max, so that includes possible incentives. We don't know if they're void years, and that's the key, I think. If we see void years in that deal, it to me says they're going to conduct business like they did last year, and that is, we're going to push money out into the future, and we're going to go for it again. And if that's the case, then obviously paying, I don't know, 8 or 9, I don't think they'll go over 10, but 8 or 9 million a year on a running back, I mean, I guess that's possible. And, you know, you mentioned Van Noy and Clowney, and we've mentioned others, you know, that would seemingly indicate that they're going to try to, you know, really go for it again. And obviously, you know, that the running back position is something that right now, I mean, until Mitchell gets back, is certainly lacking.
Yeah, Edwards, Dobbins, Cook, all free agents. You got Justice Hill's really your sure thing, and then Mitchell obviously with the injury. But you mentioned void years there, Brian, and just for a mini side tangent, would you be surprised if Baltimore went the way they did? Because they dove pretty headfirst in the void years after really not doing it last year, and obviously a lot of that had to do with Lamar's contract, but we also saw it with Odell, and we saw it with this guy and that guy. Would you be surprised if they're trying to maximize their window by throwing void years into the equation again this season?
Yeah, I mean, it would say, well, because if you remember back when Steve Bisciotti took the team over, he said he did not want to be restructuring deals. He wanted a clean cap and not have to go through, because he really just become owner when they went through the purge in 2002. So he was, you know, he didn't like that. That was not something he wanted to do again. So, but they obviously have since then. Now, another factor in that is obviously we saw this huge jump in the cap this year. Are they anticipating the same jump next year? You know, or is this, it used to be the cap would go up 10 or 11 million a year. This was a 30 mil jump. I don't know. We should expect that every year, but you know, is it going to be a 20 to 25? Is it going to flatten out a little and be 20 to 25? If that's the case, then I think you'll see a lot of teams being more willing to borrow from the future, because that's just such a huge jump. Now, obviously, with that huge jump, salaries are going to go up. So that's going to eat into that jump a lot, because agents are going to, you know, this was a 13% increase, if I remember correctly. So, you know, agents are going to go, okay, well, my asking price just went up 13%, you know, so I think the Aguilar deal will kind of give us a window into what their thinking is. And if we see that, and obviously, you know, we saw that they had 7 guys originally that had void years, and it was going to be over 23 million in dead money, and they worked 3 of those between Aguilar, OBJ's restructure, and then re-signing Pierce. They got that down to a little over 8. So you can still get away from it to an extent, but obviously, if it turns out that's the players you want to have back. You look at Rock Yassin, who was one of them, who I think were, you know, pretty clear that he wasn't coming back one way or another. So, you know, so you take the good with the bad there. And sometimes it's going to happen that you are going to eat some void years you didn't want to. But I think hopefully we'll have Aguilar's numbers tomorrow, Tuesday. And then that'll give us kind of like I said, a view into the window of maybe the way they're going to do things.
Yeah. And I feel like even with what they're doing, they're trying to maximize the window, but you made a good point with the cap, you know, what that jump is going to look like from this year to next year to the next year. Because I think this cap, it jumped due to obviously the NFL's crushed it with media rights and all of the advertising revenue they've been getting from that, their media deals. And also I think some of the COVID money coming back in a little bit after that steep decline as well. So do they anticipate as big of a jump? And does that mean that teams feel comfortable enough to take from the next 2 years or 3 years of their future. So we'll see there. But even going back to the running back conversation, Brian, you mentioned that, maybe the Ravens could go and it could be $8 million a year, $9 million, $10 million. But what do you personally feel comfortable with? If you were Eric DeCosta, what would you feel comfortable offering a running back based off the current situation the Ravens are in and just the way the position is valued right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the running back value has been certainly has gone down recently. And, the last year you saw all the guys on I think it was 3 running backs on the tag, and, they all pretty much played on 1-year deals. So I guess Taylor wasn't even a free agent. He was right. So, but he did get a deal. So, I guess the big question is, how's the huge increase in the cap? Before, you probably argue that none of the running backs would get $10 million a year, close maybe, but not much more, if any more. But now with this increase in the cap, it could be that, the top guys are looking at 12 or 13. I would be surprised. I mean, one of the reports were that Ravens were definitely doing, I don't remember who, I think it was Jeremy Fowler maybe, was that the Ravens were doing their homework, but if it got over to be more than 10 million a year, they were out. And unfortunately, that may mean they're out, because it may mean that these guys are going to get, are going to get that 12 or 13 now. I mean, that in a way that kind of brings Henry probably since he's the older, and you can probably do a shorter deal with him. That the other running backs might get better offers somewhere else, just based on the length of the deal. So Henry might be an option there. And again, if you can get him in that 8 to 10, range, then sounds like there's, like I said, we'll see, but sounds like there's definitely some interest there.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, because again, Baltimore will have to do some level of maneuvering around in their room, whether it's bringing in a lesser free agent. I know Zach Moss, there have been rumors about him potentially, or they draft a guy in the middle rounds, but I don't think it's realistic they're going to bring all 3 of their running backs in Edwards, Dobbins, and Cook back. So we'll see. And coming up in the final part of the show, we'll talk a little more about other positions for the Ravens they could spend at, plus getting into franchise tag and 5th-year option official numbers. Stay tuned. We got a lot to get to here on this episode. First, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. You can get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 if your bet wins. And I know the football season's over, but basketball season is full swing. Actually, I got the Denver Nuggets shirt going on right here. I'm a big Denver Nuggets guy when it comes to basketball. You can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more over on FanDuel. So if you want to bet Nikola Jokic with that Nuggets game, you can do it. It's a very safe bet over there with Nikola Jokic. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel official sportsbook partner of the NBA. We're back, Locked On Ravens. Kevin Ostraker, Brian McFarland, talking Ravens football with you again. Really appreciate everybody for being here with us today and making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day. Be sure to subscribe, follow along, audio form and video form for the show. Brian, this is a pretty crucial free agency period for the Ravens, and again, a lot of it is. But we talked about how important it was last year, and seemingly this is right up there. Even the Lamar Jackson situation is that was the most important piece of Ravens history almost when you talk about free agency. It's the biggest contract by far in Ravens history. But now you have important offseason in different ways for the Ravens. And a position that a lot of people are wondering about right now is wide receiver, because Odell Beckham's a free agent. You did bring back Nelson Aguilar. So you're 4 right now with Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Tylan Wallace, and Nelson Aguilar. And then, you have a couple guys around the edges. But there have been these conversations about, what if the Ravens could go get a Mike Evans? What if they could go get a Michael Pittman Jr. or go get one of those top free agents? Now, T. Higgins was franchise tagged by the Bengals. That was the first free agent move. So not that I thought that was likely, but he is now off the market. Do you see the Ravens potentially going and trying to spend big at wide receiver? They gave Odell Beckham $18 million, $15 guaranteed last offseason. Do you expect maybe this increase to do something to that position for the Ravens, or do you maybe look for them to add a middling veteran and then maybe go for a draft pick?
Yeah, I would tend to think it's probably the latter. Again, if they are going to go get a running back, I can't see them spending big on two positions. I think they probably have one big move, and as you said, they can structure it if they use void years and things like that. They could structure it to make it work. But I just, they've never been a team to really go and hit the free agent market. They seem to have, they work on getting their own guys back. And, every 3 years or so, they bring out one big signing. Now, Marcus Williams was 3 years ago. So maybe this is the timeline, but getting two, I would be kind of surprised. So it may be wide receiver or running back, and they may go out there with plan A and plan B, or plan A and plan A 1A, and right. Whichever we get first, then then we follow the rest of that plan. And now one thing before the break we talked about running backs, and you said something that triggered something in my mind. This is not a very good draft for running backs. So that makes those top free agents perhaps even harder to get, because they're kind of in the driver's seat a little more than running backs have been in the last few years. I think some reports are there might not even be. Well, there isn't going to be a first round running back, and there may not be one till the 50s. So almost all the way through the second round. So I think that factors in. Wide receiver, I think it's a decent draft for wide receiver, certainly at the top. So if you're going to get a first round, if you're going to use a first round pick there, but they'll do what they always do, and that is pretty much get a veteran starter quality guy in place for just about every position before the draft, and that then allows them to be, do their best player available, and not have to reach for somebody at a position. So we'll see. I like I said, I would doubt that there would be two big signings, but obviously the way they handled their cap last year was a surprise for all of us. So maybe this is the new norm now, which I think will keep. If it is, I think that'll excite fans for sure.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one or the other. I completely agree with you. And to your point, I think that it's actually pretty decent running back class in terms of free agency. The draft, you're 100% right. It is not good whatsoever. Yeah. But you have, the Henrys and Barkleys and Jacobs, and you also have guys like Tony Pollard and Austin Eckler. And I mentioned Zach Moss a little earlier, Donta Foreman. Like you have tiers here where I think the running back position, it's like you might get a second rounder. You're going to probably get a couple third rounders, but you're going to see most of those guys probably taken on day 3, essentially. So the wide receiver class is much deeper in the draft, and I could see them going that direction and then bringing in a big ticket running back. We'll see, but you mentioned how they maneuver their cap compared to last year, and I kind of mentioned at the top of the third segment here, but how much different do you expect this offseason to be? Because I think when you talk about last year, it all hinged to Lamar. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, where couldn't really make a move until you figured out, okay, are we doing this with Lamar? How is this going to impact future years? And we waited, I think, Brian, it was 3 weeks or a month before Nelson Aguilar, when that was the first signing the Ravens had. Now with the Marcus Williams year, they waited a day and everybody was freaking out because all these moves are made. Then they go and they get Marcus Williams, Morgan Moses, and technically Zadarius Smith, although we all know how that turned out. So, do you expect, because usually what the Ravens do is they sit back a little bit. They don't just dive head first, right when it starts. There aren't like 5 announcements going on. I expect them to kind of sit back a little bit, let the market play out, and then maybe guys who weren't expected to be there, who are still there, mulling offers, but maybe don't have the market they thought. I feel like that's when the Ravens usually like to pounce on guys.
Yeah, for sure. And I think much like it was last year with Lamar, but I think the one big variable is going to be, if they are going to tag Madubuike, can they get a deal done before that, or at least before the beginning of the league year? At $22 million, obviously it takes up a big chunk of cap space. If they can get him signed, maybe that first year cap number is 9, 10, 11 million, in that range. So they've saved 10, 11, 12, depending upon where the numbers fall, in cap space this year. And that goes a long way towards, if it's going to be a $10 million running back, there it is, Right. So that's something, as we saw last year, they really they kind of sat out free agency for the most part. other than, basically some minor guys. And then, Beckham and Aguilar was pretty much it. So that's going to be the big variable there. And obviously it's much better to get that long-term deal done. And that's why we probably will not see, if they use the tag, we probably won't see it till the last minute. For whatever reason, it seems like when players get tagged, the negotiations end. And the team's got to go on to the rest of their business, getting ready for the beginning of the league year. So hopefully, and that's their leverage. If we don't get it done before then, we're going to tag you. So let's get a deal done, that works out for everybody. So I don't think they'll use that till the end. And, so it kind of keeps us up in the air a little bit on where it's going to be, but hopefully, I guess in one case, hopefully no news is good news. It doesn't mean because there's not so far apart that there's no way they're going to get there. And they just say, forget about it. Let's just put the tag on and move on. So, so I think that's another thing going to be a big tell is if they can get that done, because that's a lot of cap space opened up to be able to do other things.
Yeah, it's a good point because it's a huge chunk of change that's kind of tied to one player there. And there is the possibility for an extension, as we know when Lamar signed that extension, some money opened up for him. In fact, a lot of money opened up for him. So it'd be the same thing with Madubuike, especially with that year one base salary there. But speaking of the franchise tag number for Madubuike officially set over at $22 million. So projections had him right around $20.9, $21 million. So that's pretty much in line, just $1 million over. And then for the fifth-year option numbers, Brian, we now know Rashad Bateman and Odafe Oweh both on the basic plans in terms of, how the fifth-year options have changed based off of playtime incentives and accolades. Bateman comes in at 14.3 and Odafe Oweh comes in at 13.3. For those two guys, again, the projections, it's not too far off what the projections actually were. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago, but even a slight increase is an increase. Does that change your mind? I think last time we talked, you said decline Bateman, pick up Oweh. Is that still your stance? Yeah,
I think so. I don't think it's a million or so difference is going to change their opinion on we want this guy around in Oweh's case. So, I mean, if it was a $3 or $4 million difference, then that might be problematic. I do think if they were considering Bateman, that might push them out because $14 million for what they've seen so far. Unfortunately, I mean, there's the flashes are there, and we've all seen all the stories on separation and things like that. But for whatever reason, between he and Lamar, and or he's the third option, and then Lamar never gets to him, or whatever it is. He's not getting primary reads so I just think there's some disconnect there that, watch him go off this year. And I'm sure they'll be happy, just like Queen did. They'll be happy to see that happen and, worry about it next year. But I think that fifth year option is too out there for him for sure.
And then it almost kind of changes depending on what they do in the draft, what the complexion of that room looks like, because if Bateman's declined, the only guy you have is Zay Flowers for 2025, assuming they don't bring in, a top flight first round wide receiver, or they don't make another move. So they're going to have to figure out that room in that regard. But you mentioned Oweh in the edge position, Brian. There have been some things floating around about potentially Brian Burns, and he's been connected to the Ravens here, connected to the Ravens there. Now, the reality of Brian Burns is he's going to earn one hefty contract. He's earned that throughout his career in the play he's had. But there was one scenario, and I think it was a first-round pick, a third-round pick, and David Ajabo for Brian Burns. Now, we can talk about the compensation. It's one thing just to talk about that. But on top of it, it would have to be some sort of a tag and trade type deal, essentially. And with Burns, with those big splash moves, because you can talk about the Marcus Williams deal, that 5-year, $7 million contract. You can structure that, this, that, and the other. But for those, Burns will probably break $100 million. I'd be shocked if he didn't break $100 million here.
No doubt.
For those type of contracts, is that something that the Ravens can now afford? Like, if that's their big one move, like you talked about, or is there kind of a cutoff to what that big move can be with the cap situation they have right now?
Yeah, I would be shocked because you'd be paying both Madubuike and Burns top of the market money. I don't recall them ever paying two players in the same offseason top of the market money. Maybe they did back when they were re-signing Ray and, and J.O. or something like that, But otherwise, I would think that's exorbitant. I also think the draft pick compensation is problematic because with a quarterback contract that's going to be escalating over the next couple of years in cap cost, you need your draft picks. You need to hit them, because that's your cheap labor for the next 4 years. So that's something that I would be highly surprised. Now, could there be some sort of trade, with like they got Calais Campbell. So that's how that's gonna play out. But I just would be shocked. Yeah.
It's something where you have to figure out how you maneuver the cap situation, especially with the quarterback with Lamar Jackson and having that contract there. There's a lot to figure out with that because it just changes how you do everything. So there's a lot to think about with it, but the Ravens do, as the rest of the NFL did, get a lot of extra cap space, and hopefully they use it well. But Brian, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for hopping on. Please tell people where they can find you and what you're working on here, as we now have even more cap information.
Sure. So on Twitter at Raven Salary Cap, and then my articles are on RussellStreetReport.com. My big postseason or preseason, I guess I should say, article was out just 2 weeks ago, I guess now. That will be, once we get a couple little more details cap wise, I'll update that as we get closer, whether Matabike's tag hits by then, or we'll know some other cap things before, so we can kind of figure out where they really are. There's a couple more adjustments we're still waiting to find out about. So that will happen. And then obviously as players are cut, signed, restructured, pay cut, whatever it might be, we try to get that information out as quickly as we can and put the numbers together for everybody.
Yeah, those moves will be trickling out over the next, whether it's a couple days, couple weeks, as we get into free agency. Brian, again, appreciate your time. The links to all Brian's work in the description below. Be sure to check him out. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can subscribe, follow along, video form, audio form, the whole 9 yards. Come up tomorrow, more Ravens content. Stay tuned. See you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.